BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And, well, turning points in history, as you know if you've listened to this podcast, I believe we're living at the biggest one right now. And this turning point is especially a turning point for Europe, I think, for reasons I don't particularly need to explain. But I'm really thrilled to welcome to the studio Luuk van Middelaar, who is simply one of the most respected and deepest thinkers about Europe and political theory we have at the moment. Luuk, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Philip. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Luuk, you have been a political speechwriter. You have written books about the pandemic and what it did to Europe, also about the power, and we will come back to that, and the importance of improvisation in politics, which is a fantastic topic, especially for somebody involved with Europe. But you now also head the newly founded Brussels Institute for Geopolitics with its very appealing acronym BIG. This institute, I have read on your website, is set up to get Europe in shape for big power politics. Now that sounds an exciting idea, and it sounds a particularly exciting idea for me because I've just been going around and writing in various outlets that what has happened between the US and Europe is really, to my mind, the biggest shakeup in European history. And I was interested that you've used the same number since the Napoleonic Wars. Really, this is big history. This is not a little rift in the transatlantic partnership. This is a completely historic new reset for Europe. Would you agree with that?
No, absolutely. I think if you talk about turning points, it is. I think a lot of focus has been in the past 3-4 years, of course, especially since Putin's invasion of Ukraine. On that side of the story, on Russia under Putin putting an end to the world order of what we call the post-Cold War, the post-1989 order. But in a way, that is not a big scoop anymore. It's something we also had seen coming maybe for a decade or so, and there's a number of other things as well. But in a way, what is happening under Trump and the relationship between Europe and America is more fundamental, I also believe, because it puts an end to the world of after 1945. So it puts an end to a longer period of history, which was also more fundamental, of course, particular for Western Europe, but also for Europe at large, because, of course, since 1945 and Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, all successive US presidents have committed to the security of Europe with the US Army, with soldiers, etc. Ever, you could say, since the landing on the beach of Normandy in June 1944, to take that kind of symbolic moment of a new era. And in a way, it seems as if that is now coming to an end, as if, to use the language, the boats are now going the other way. And in a way, we always knew this was going to happen one day. That's ever, I think, since the Soviet Union is no longer the main, now Russia no longer the main strategic rival of the United States, there was also always going to come the day that the US was going home, so to say. I'm not saying they are tomorrow and we can zoom in on that, but in a way, the undercurrent is they are leaving. And the fact that Trump is putting into doubt, for instance, the security guarantee embedded in the famous NATO Article 5.
It seems to be more than that. It seems to be more than that, Luuk, because to just sort of make myself strong for the other parallel, the Napoleonic Wars, around 1800 or so, and of course this happened here in Vienna, the Vienna Congress, the reordering of Europe in a much more modern shape, in a much more state shape that already had the national states as we would know them later. But it was a Europe that was in an imperial order, and that was very much the imperial master of the world towards the outside. And you could argue that the world after 45 prolonged that imperial logic with the help of the United States. Even if the international order had shifted from an imperial order to a rules-based order. And that seems to have ended now. We're back in the world of imperial powers, but not in a world of international rules. And Europe is no longer an imperial power and is finding itself in a completely different environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when in a way, somewhere between the First and the Second World War, European states took leave of the global stage. France and the UK, well, they clinged on a bit until let's say, the early 50s, and then with the whole movement of decolonization, Europe and European states have basically been preoccupied with themselves, with the reordering under the US and umbrella and Soviet occupation or influence, is part with reordering their own continent and leaving the rest of the world. And that world, I think, after 1945, the way I see it, the US was the dominant force shaping that order. I leave aside now the Cold War dimension and the US-Soviet rivalry and all that. As far as Europe was concerned, in a way, the US was the center of the universe, of a whole system of satellite states as it was built from 1945. Think of the United Nations, 45, the central place of the dollar in the monetary system, Bretton Woods, 1944, and also in Europe, 49, NATO. So, and what we now see, I think the dollar is a good example where you really have one currency as a kind of central linchpin underpinning all the rest. And what we're now seeing with Trump is in a way, it's the sun leaving the solar system of that world of after 1945. And it leaves the Europeans, and I see that, and I talk to advisors of leaders, etc. It leaves them rudderless. They're disoriented. They don't know what is happening. And that's why it's, I think, important what you do and what we also aim to do at our institute, to bring the kind of historical perspective and say, yeah, listen, we are in one of these convulsive moments of world history. We're in the thick of it. But there will be something after that. And there are, of course, not least in the people around Trump or the President Trump himself, they are also thinking in these historic terms. I think that should not be underestimated. The US Trade Representative said to a diplomatic delegation from Germany, and I spoke to one of its members, that they are preparing a world order for the next 100 years. So they're also thinking in these long-term trends.
That's a very, very interesting point. I mean, first of all, a clarification. If we describe the post-war order with a stable dollar and the United States at the center, that is not moral approval. That is simply historical description. It's not the world as it was supposed to be, but it was the world as it certainly was for a while. But thinking about this going further, here's what appears to me, and I'd really like a nuanced reply to that, because I always suspect myself of being too simplistic in my thinking. The EU was a very successful construction in the context of an international rules-based order, where you could make treaties and you could expect that they would be followed and there would be predictable politics in the world. In a great power order, in an imperial order, the EU, which, as you've pointed out in many of your writings, is notoriously slow to decide, needs endless consultations, has nobody who can say yes or no to anything, may no longer be the right construction. And it seems to me that in the construction as it is at the moment, we basically have hostile powers, and we already see them operating, from Russia to even the United States, unfortunately, through troll armies, through misinformation, through fake news, through party financing, through election interference. They can pick off one European country after the other and transform it into some sort of puppet regime of a foreign power. And it seems to me that the only alternative to that would be some sort of federal construction for Europe, a construction that could include Britain, that would not have to include Hungary, that could even include Canada, that would be more able to act and to defend its own interests, and especially the interests of democracy. Is that a completely overblown scenario?
I don't think it will go very fast in that direction. And as you asked for a nuanced answer, Philip, I'll try to provide one. I fully agree with the starting point. The European Union, as it was built after the Second World War, and then in a way refounded after 1989 as European Union, was not built to deal with great power politics. It has all the qualities of predictability, of inclusiveness, of reliability, which are appreciated by market operators, by citizens, but which are frowned upon by strongmen around the world and also at our borders. So that's why it is important for Europe, and I'll zoom in on Europe and what different meanings the word Europe can have, and EU and Europe and NATO, because you've thrown Canada as well in the mix. But let's say at the level of the principles, Europe needs to reorganize itself in a way to protect its own security, and also to be able to take decisions faster and better with a view to their strategic consequences. Because we are no longer in the end of history world which suited the European Union perfectly. In a way, the European Union itself was the embodiment of that worldview. It was Francis Fukuyama for one continent, and that worked marvelously well.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt your thought because I find it really exciting, but just this end of history idea, it also led to a lot of European hubris, as the US was doing the dirty military stuff around the world, and we Europeans could focus on peace and inclusion and civil rights and culture.
Well, I think the word hubris first and foremost applies to the US. It led to debacles like Iraq and Afghanistan because they were going to bring the end of history and accelerate the march of history in faraway places. In Europe, hubris, but there maybe the word I would use first and foremost is complacency. It led to the feeling that...
It led to a feeling that Europe was doing well because of its unique virtues.
Yes.
And not because of an international construction that was very helpful.
Exactly. It led to a kind of also at times lecturing and a feeling of moral superiority, because we had already arrived at the end of history and we're going to bring that, the Americans more with bombs and we with leaflets and brochures and PowerPoints to the rest of the world as well. Now, I think we are no longer there, and the rest of the world already noticed that a while ago, and Europeans are not taking that seriously anymore. However, for us or for Europeans here to take fully conscience of that shift of power in the world is another matter and is taking more time. We are past that stage, and now I think there is a growing awareness within Europe, capitals, chancelleries, and also here in Brussels where I work, that no longer works. We now need to get ready for a much rougher game out there. But of course, that's easier said than done, and it has been said already for a couple of years. You will remember, as a close observer of European and also German politics, that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen already back in 2019 said boldly, I want to lead a geopolitical commission, and nobody quite knew what it meant. And the intention is there, but it is not so easy to change the whole mindset and mentality of an institution which was basically constructed against geopolitics, against the whole idea of power, of strategy, even of interests. You mentioned among other roles, I've been a speechwriter to one of the EU presidents back in 2010, 2014. I worked for European Council President Herman Van Rompuy, so the man chairing the summits. And in those days, it was even almost taboo to use the word power when speaking about Europe, because Europe was about values. It was taboo to use the term interest, European interest, because it smacked too much of national interests. And
it cost a German president his job, that idea. I mean, when Mr. Köhler, who was never a very good German president, but he had an honest moment when he said on a flight that, of course, Germany was defending its economic interests in the Hindu Kush, so in Afghanistan. And this very nasty truth caused such a wave of disgust in Germany that he had to resign.
Well, I think today that would no longer happen, but it's very telling for a previous period, and also telling for because the result, of course, is utter hypocrisy and a disconnect between political action and decisions, or economic action and decisions, and the public discourse. And I think that is ultimately very harmful, because it is at the cost of credibility of public discourse. Because anybody else, our interlocutors in the Western world, can understand that European states or companies or private actors, they pursue their interests. They may do so also with values or with a sense of solidarity and everything, but ultimately there are also interests underpinning their actions. And I think denying that is not doing a service to either truth or moral justice. So, but as I said, easier said than done to change that mindset. And I think the mindset, the mentality, is maybe even more fundamental than the institutions. Because I think, Philip, the point that you were alluding to is to say, well, how can this even work? Decision making is so slow. There's 27 today member states, in many cases, not least foreign affairs. They all have a veto, so they can easily block a rapid response, and it is a trick or a lever over power, which, for instance, Viktor Orban uses quite often today when it comes to Russian sanctions or statements about Israel, etc. So let's just get rid of this, and I'm now going to simplify your argument, whereas you presented in a more nuanced way, but let's just build this one European federal state one way or another. There, indeed, I have a more nuanced view. I think we are not faced with the fateful alternative of unite or die, in that very strong sense, in which the United States of America experienced it at the late 18th century. Brussels will not one day be a kind of Washington of a federal Europe, and we may applaud that or regret it, but I think it is also a result of the history of our continent. You are right at the middle in Vienna. I'm a little bit closer to the Atlantic coast here in Brussels, but as you know, it's a continent of many languages, political cultures, different histories. Just to mention France and Germany, Poland, the UK, Italy, etc. they cannot be molded in the same way as back in the days the states of New York, Virginia, and North Carolina could. However, that does not mean that we are stuck with the current situation. I think there is a form of European collective agency which can be organized, which is being organized, and which is also about doing things together as European states. You can have, let's put it differently, you can have Europe speaking with one voice if President Trump can call to Commission President von der Leyen.
Yes, I mean, this is Obama's old question. If I want to call Europe, which number do I dial?
Yeah, it's the Kissinger and others have phrased it numerous times. Today, what happened is they make the phone call together with 4 or 5 of them. We are today the 21st of May, so about 10 days ago there was a train journey of 4 European leaders who jointly went to Kiev. Very interesting, practically and symbolically important trip. French President Macron, new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, it was just the second or the third day he was in office. Also Donald Tusk, Polish Prime Minister, so the 3 of them. But also Keir Starmer, British Prime Minister, so non-EU state, so we have UK as well.
And for the record, they did not use cocaine.
They did not use cocaine. They were victims to some Russian disinformation campaigns, but they were well received by Zelensky. They spoke together with Zelensky, and later on there was another summit early in the week. The 4 of them called Trump, who debriefed them about his call with Putin. So there is a kind of plural voice of the states of Europe. And I think, Philip, that's also something which interests you as a historian of turning points. Because what I think, what we see here at these moments of war and peace, and you mentioned the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna, same 1648, another historic turning point, and the Westphalia Congresses, etc. At these moments, it's really the states, and particularly the big states of Europe, getting together, huddling, and reorganizing the continent. And that's a little bit what we are also seeing now. So this is not a moment, at this moment in time, when there is a horrible war going on along a 1,000 plus kilometer front line on the European continent. This is not the moment yet for the institutions, for the EU to come in, which is really, as we discussed, a more rules-based machinery, which brings expertise, bureaucratic procedures, etc. This is a moment still of the states of Europe: France, Germany, Poland, Italy. Maloney is also playing an interesting role, because after that there was another call where she was on, and the UK. I like an old-fashioned concert, the European concert, like in the days of Metternich after your cherished and beloved Vienna Congress. Together, somehow speaking for Europe. Again, we are trying to analyze, to decrypt what we see in front of our eyes as part of this historic moment. And for me, I'm not there to say, well, they should send Commission President von der Leyen or European Council President Antonio Costa, the former Prime Minister of Portugal, who now chairs summits, to Putin. That doesn't work. President Putin, he respects strength. He respects France and Germany. He has had dealings with them, or he knows that Russia has had dealings with France for 3 centuries. He knows that Russia has had dealings with the Germans in whatever capacity, the Prussians and etc. for centuries. And that's what he sees when he sees Macron. Whereas and it's regrettable maybe, but when Putin sees representatives of the EU, and I as we discussed, I worked for one such president. He does not see power; he sees bureaucracy. So that Europe needs to be. It needs to. It would be good if it changed, but and for some other in other contexts, the EU institutional Europe does have power and carries weight. And if you want another U.S. presidential example, during the first term of Donald Trump, there were also, let's say, a lot of turmoil in trade and close to trade war, and then all EU leaders at the time, and this was Merkel and Hollande, Macron, and the others. They said Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission president, he will talk to Donald, right? Because then also Donald Trump, he wanted to do business with all of them individually and separately and play one against the other, as you described, which they all any strongman would like to do. And then they collectively backed up Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, said you negotiate with him, and that worked. Also because Trump respected Jean-Claude Juncker as a wily politician and deal maker to his heart. So it's not black or white. Huh? But the phenomenon I was describing here. We are in a very peculiar, historic moment of history in the present of war. Then you see that EU institutions take more of a backseat on the issues of the ceasefire, etc. But at the same time, they do play a role, also the Commission and the Council, in thinking about rearmament and defense and industry. Once the issues get a little bit more economic or technical, there is that interplay, which I'm close to enthusiastic about, as you hear, that interplay between European capitals and Brussels, which is exactly right for a continent which is united and plural at the same time.
This interplay is united and plural, but it doesn't often seem to be united enough, especially in the time when concerted action is necessary. So my question is really, are you optimistic that the EU is a suitable vessel for Europe's future? Is it reformable enough? Or do we need another structure to carry us into that future?
Personally, I think the EU is the best vehicle on offer. It's also reformable. Work is currently underway to make sure that EU, as we discussed, is better able of bringing in that power dimension, helping the states of Europe to rearm, of making sure that economic and foreign policy considerations, which in any bureaucracy and in Brussels even more than anywhere else, are treated separately, are brought together in a more strategic view on the world, as they would have in the White House or in Beijing. So there is definitely reform possibilities. But again, I'm going to be nuanced. There is also NATO, and there's also other organizations which still exist. And maybe there's one I need to mention, a funny one, a little bit, I think, underestimated, which is the so-called European Political Community. It's a club of 44 European states. They met now 6 times, and they are exactly, I don't know whether you followed this at all, Philip, but they were a response to the war, to the invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago in May 22. It was French President Macron who called for a kind of concert of Europe, to again use that term, for all European states to discuss shared security interests. They first met in Prague in October 22, and last week in Tirana in Albania. for the sixth time, so every twice a year. And that is interesting because it is not the EU. It is all European states. The UK is there. They love it. Turkish president has been a number of times. The candidate countries of the EU, like Serbia and others, they're there. The states of Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan have attended. Norway, Switzerland. Norway is in NATO, but Switzerland is neither in the EU nor in NATO. So this is really Europe as a continent meeting. And something like that did not exist, at least not to talk about security and energy and shared interests. And again, it's a sign that the European continent, that there is some, that the moment is heated, and that there is a kind of awareness that the forms of the previous era, some of them need to be improved and some of them need to be, how to put it, to be accompanied by other institutional forms. That brings me also to Canada. I think that's, for me, Canada is on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, geography is a powerful thing.
Geography matters, and also in the world which you described of the imperial spheres, imperial leaders, in a way, it's clear for President Putin the way he looks at the world, to some extent for Xi Jinping as well, but as many have discussed. Trump too, he has this kind of territorial view and thinking first and foremost, of course, about America, as in the US, but then about the Americas, including Canada, Mexico, Greenland, Panama, the Panama Canal, and a little detail, which is always interesting also for us as historians to see bigger things in small details. But it struck me that in Trump's inaugural address in January, he did not mention Russia at all, nor Ukraine. He did not mention China. He did not mention Taiwan, which was the big obsession of everybody in Washington, at least under Biden and before. But he did mention China twice, but only in the context, Philip, of the Panama Canal. It was basically to say, this is our turf. This is my turf. I mark my territory. I don't want to see Chinese containers in the Panama Canal. He does not care a bit whatever happens to democracy in Taiwan or to human rights in China or whatever. But so a very territorial view. And I think Canada is probably part of that territorial view. And I think at the moment when Europe also organizes itself as a continent, that's maybe one bridge too far.
That may well be, but let me ask you about this transformational moment and something that you've pointed out. At the moment, there are many people who think that radical transformation is necessary, but frankly unrealistic, because we're all too saturated, too fat, too lazy to do anything radical, and that seems to be the pessimistic end of it. I don't quite buy that, because I think we are the children and grandchildren of people who have themselves undergone incredible social change after the Second World War. I mean, certainly Germany completely reinvented itself and its assumptions. And Europe has invented itself, we've already mentioned some of those points, actually a number of times very radically. In those reinventions, you can always see that first of all, they never happen without an external force, without a crisis. But secondly, the countries that do well out of them tend to be the countries that reform early and radically, whereas countries that paradoxically are still powerful enough to delay necessary change for a while often emerge from it very much worse.
So now I'm going to play the interviewer. Give me some examples, Philip.
Well, I give you some examples. I mean, my most the most simplistic example would be Amsterdam and Madrid, or the Habsburg Empire the Spanish Habsburg Empire and the Netherlands in the Little Ice Age, when it was understood in Amsterdam that we need to invest in a new world that involves overseas trade, that involves a literate population, that involves democratic change because literate people want to have participate in power. It was an open acceptance of a very different society that would come into being if this project was begun. Spain, meanwhile, in which which did not have a reason to change, which had huge imports of silver from the colonies, which had a stable economy, which was the most powerful, which was the USA of its day, in an empire in which the sun famously didn't set, did not agree to any changes. And it foundered in this world. It foundered for economic reasons, it foundered for political reasons, but it really re-emerged into history after the death of General Franco. It fell into a period of deep provincialization. So I do think that reforming early can be a very important asset. Reforming too late is often, as Gorbachev remarked, a punishment. But you have remarked that Europe is particularly good at assuring the freedom of its citizens, at being predictable, and at creating consensus. But that to implement change, you need to be able to protect people, you need to improvise politically, and you need to allow opposition. So really, what Europe needs to do now is exactly what is not in its DNA.
I think we discussed how difficult it is. At the same time, there is, if you look 10 years back, which is not a long time in historic perspective, there is fundamental change in the way Europe positions itself. The youths pick up on that word of protection. I think that is now really become a hallmark, protection and security, offering security of what the European Union wants to do. Whereas until 10, 15 years ago, it was indeed all about offering freedoms, opportunities to its citizens, which is a tendency which was, of course, further exacerbated by the really economic liberalism underpinning the whole project when it started as a common market, more than the political liberties. I think the Brexit vote was already a kind of turning point on a smaller scale of that policy message, because it could be read, of course, as a just British exceptionalism and nationalism and discomfort with being part of Europe. And that's definitely part of the story. But it was also a signal which the British voters sent in that referendum. And they may regret retroactively, but it's something else, that the EU was too much about liberties and freedoms and not enough about protection, or as the winning phrase had at the time, about control, about offering security, both in the sense of social security and welfare state arrangements, which came to be seen as also being undermined by the EU, in France more so than in the UK, for other reasons. But also the EU not being well equipped either conceptually or practically to deal with issues of borders and migration. It was, after all, an organization being built to tear down borders in the economic sphere, above all, obstacles to free movement of goods and capital. And it was not at all in the way it thought about itself there to protect or guard external borders. This is the same period, I would say, 2015, 16, there was what was then called the refugee or migration crisis, the Brexit vote, the first Trump election. All this is about a decade ago, but that shift started then, I would say, of official discourse about Europe more in terms of offering protection, starting to think about borders and identity as well. But what is now being added in the current really geostrategic drama is the power politics dimension, and the sense that if we do not organize ourselves better collectively, uh, both our security and our freedoms will be at stake. It is not the one or the other, but if Putin or Trump get their way one way or another, we lose really, in a way, the freedom to shape our own lives individually or collectively in Europe. And I think that is the very start message of these first few months of this year.
How does this new institute of geopolitics that you are leading fit into that process? You say that it's to get Europe in shape for power politics. I mean, how do you do that? You have polite conversations with senior politicians and tell them that they really ought to wake up?
Well, that's part of the job description, yes. But that's not all. No, in a way, we are, as the name says, we are Sign of the Times, founded in 2022. And the two words Brussels and geopolitics were, until recently, really in two different spheres. It's like black snow. No? And now there is a sense that Brussels, so Europe and the European Union, needs to equip itself better for this. And we see each other as a catalyst to accelerate that change, which is necessary, indeed, with conversations, but also with events and publications and reports, and by connecting people and making that case, and by also connecting people, as we discussed earlier, both here in Brussels, but also decision makers in EU capitals, like those around European leaders who should not be forgotten, meet, well, maybe at least 8 or sometimes 10 times per year at European summits, where you have all the presidents and prime ministers gathering. And this is where the big strategic decisions are taken. So Europe, in the way we look at it, is not just Brussels, whatever the name of our institute says. It's really about thinking about the continent and this, as we discussed before, interplay between the states and the European institutions. And that's really a fascinating adventure. And what is in a way heartening is that maybe when with a friend we first thought about this 4 or 5 years ago, it was kind of uphill, well, not really uphill struggle, but you needed to spend a bit of time to explain why this was relevant, etc. But of course, with everything which has happened with Putin and Trump, to put it simply, it is much easier to understand why a hub for a strategic conversation in Brussels to bring that dimension of historical thinking, because that's, for me, really important. I was trained as historian and political theorist myself. It's so some of my colleagues, and Brussels is really a town of, you can imagine that, Philip, of lawyers, economists, political scientists. So
no historical depth.
No historical depth, or some people have it on an individually, but it's not a quality which is appreciated by the machinery. It doesn't help you. And we think it's very important in these times of dramatic historic change to have some of that historic awareness in the way we are discussing about it now, of history in the present. So an awareness of the speed with which events can change world orders. I think an awareness also of the surprises you can get in historical movements like this, the twists and turns and sometimes the ironies of history as well. And also, which I find very fundamental, because some historians tend to have a worldview which is very fatalistic, in the sense that you look at the past and you can explain everything. It had to happen that way because it had to be that way. But if you are a historian, let's say, of the present, you have a view on history as it unfolds, of political choices made in the present. You also have a strong awareness, I think, of human freedom and the capacity to change things with our own choices. And that's why um, uh, the blend of, at the same time, what is maybe determined, the circumstances, the conditions in which we operate on the one hand, and which can protect us against hubris and the idea that we can change everything. But at the same time, it's very fundamental also, if you look at history, that there are moments which we can shape ourselves, where it matters what we do individually or collectively. And I think that kind of agency is what Europe really needs after a period of 80 years, to come back to that, where we outsourced our strategic thinking and security to an external actor in the case.
We outsourced a lot of things. We outsourced so many things, but I think it's a very, very important point that you make there about the agency that we have. I think one of the advantages of being an historian, of thinking historically, is that you see that there's no such thing as a linear development that just goes into the future as it seems to be going now. And yes, that small things can make big differences, sometimes random things. I once speaking to a systems theorist who told me that, in a stable system, the action of any individual actor is completely irrelevant. But in an unstable system, a small action can have a large, if largely unpredictable, effect. I thought that was quite interesting. But a last question to you. Luuk. You heard my ravings about a federal Europe, and incidentally, that is a new raving. I wouldn't have had that before the Ukraine war. I think that has really changed the game very profoundly. But what do you think? Where would you like to see Europe going, and where do you think is, shall we say, an ambitious but realistic path for Europe? What could Europe actually do? I do think, let's make a litmus test. I do think the test for a new Europe will be whether it can or cannot guarantee a peace in Ukraine.
I agree with that. I think one litmus test will be for Europe to be able to take care of its own security, or the security of Europe at large, for the European continent to secure a stable order, with or without Russia. That's another matter we've discussed in another podcast, for the European continent. And currently, the EU cannot do it, which is humiliating and distressing. But I think it is something that Europe should be able to do in 5 to 10 years from now. I think that is a realistic time frame. It will mean massive investment in financial terms, but also in terms of political will, as we discussed, both for the decision making, but also in terms of public opinion, to all realize that we are entering a new era without our American protector, and that we have to do this together now. So for me, that's really, and I, again, if you allow me, I'll take the 5 to 10 year time frame. Europe should be able to do that, and that includes indeed security for Ukraine as well. But that is not all. I think there also is an opportunity for Europe currently to invest much more and more strategically in innovation, and to attract talent from the United States.
Where it's being chased away at the moment.
Well, it's being chased away. So we could maybe engineer some kind of reverse brain drain of researchers and academics in, be it in AI or pharmaceuticals.
Wouldn't that be fun? I mean, look at the effect. Look at the effect that Jewish emigres had on the United States in the 1940s. What they did for Hollywood, what they did for American sciences, what they did for architecture and city planning. Wouldn't that be an interesting thing if we now were at the beginning of a reverse movement like that?
No, I think that would be very interesting and something. A lot of or more political energy and activity should go in that direction. And maybe to conclude, a third front of action is really also for the European continent to reposition itself in the relations with the rest of the world. The big risk, zooming out to the broad strategic panorama, is for Europe to be or remain maybe a vessel of the United States, and then being squeezed in a US-China strategic rivalry where we will be forced, in the worst of cases, to fight the wars of the Americans against the People's Republic of China. To get out of that squeeze, we need to be stronger ourselves, but we cannot do it on ourselves. I think it is very important for European actors and European states and the European Union to also engage with other powers, some call them middle powers in the world, like Indonesia, like Brazil, like India, which is on itself on its way of becoming a great power, because it is only, I think, in some kind of partnership or arrangement or cooperations with these actors and powers that we can escape that risk again of this American-Chinese squeeze, and exist for ourselves and secure, as we discussed, ours prosperity and freedoms on this continent.
Look, it's been an absolute pleasure batting around ideas about Europe's past and particularly its future. Thank you for being my guest, and I hope to see you soon again.
With pleasure, with pleasure.
And thank you for listening to the BlomCast, and do subscribe. You can now also send us a little bit of money so that we can put this podcast further into the world and create more episodes. They do cost a bit, but I must say I find it's great fun. I'm having great conversations with some of you, and I'm having great conversations with fantastic guests, of whom Luuk van Middelaar was one. Luuk, thank you, and have a wonderful day in Brussels. I hope to speak to you soon. Bye-bye.